On the morning of March 17, 1943, Luftwaffe test pilot Flugzeugführer Böttcher climbed into the cockpit of a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress at the Rechlin Experimental Test Center, deep in the forests of Mecklenburg. The aircraft wore German markings now, black crosses on silver wings, the Balkenkreuz symbol where American stars had been painted just 3 months earlier. Yellow undersurfaces marked it as a captured enemy machine. Property of the Reich, Böttcher had flown nearly every German aircraft in production: Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, Junkers bombers, Heinkel night fighters. He knew what to expect from German engineering, understood the compromises German designers made between speed and armor, between firepower and fuel capacity. But sitting in this American cockpit, surrounded by instruments labeled in English, breathing air that still smelled faintly of American cigarettes and leather, he was about to discover something that would shake his understanding of aerial warfare. Behind him in the fuselage, German engineers waited at the gun positions. They had spent 3 months examining every rivet, every cable, every mechanism of this machine. They had measured barrel lengths and calculated firing angles. They had studied ammunition types and feed systems. They had done the mathematics on paper. Now, they would test their findings. In the air, the 4 Wright Cyclone engines coughed to life, their sound different from any German radial. Deeper, more powerful. The bomber vibrated with barely restrained energy as Böttcher advanced the throttles. This aircraft, captured intact near Leeuwarden in the Netherlands 4 months earlier, was designated Wolfhound by its American crew. The first B-17 Flying Fortress the Luftwaffe had managed to capture in flyable condition. What the test engineers would discover in the skies over Rechlin that day would fundamentally alter German fighter tactics for the rest of the war. And what they would not discover, could not fully comprehend, even after months of testing, was that they were looking at only one small piece of a much larger industrial puzzle. The Americans called it the Flying Fortress. The Germans were about to understand why. The war in the air over Europe had become a brutal mathematics problem. By early 1943, German fighters defending the Reich faced formations of American heavy bombers that seemed to arrive in ever-increasing numbers, flying at altitudes where oxygen was thin and temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero. These bombers carried tons of high explosives to German cities, factories, and transportation networks. Stopping them had become a matter of national survival. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress first entered combat over Europe with the Royal Air Force in the summer of 1941. The RAF received 20 aircraft designated Fortress Mark I. The British quickly discovered these early models were poorly suited for European combat operations. The aircraft lacked sufficient defensive armament. Their oxygen systems failed at high altitude, causing crew members to pass out during missions. Their guns froze in the sub-zero temperatures above 20,000 feet. The RAF withdrew the Fortress from bombing operations after suffering heavy losses. Some British commanders concluded the entire concept of daylight strategic bombing was fundamentally flawed. The aircraft simply could not defend itself against determined fighter opposition. German intelligence officers filed reports noting the RAF's failures with satisfaction. The American bomber posed no serious threat to the Reich, but the Americans were learning. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, American military planners studied the British experience carefully. They understood the early B-17 models had weaknesses, but they also believed those weaknesses could be addressed through improved tactics, better training, and most importantly, through aggressive up-armament of the aircraft itself. The B-17E, which entered production in September 1941, represented the first major redesign of the Flying Fortress for combat operations. Boeing engineers added powered gun turrets. They installed a tail turret with twin 50-caliber machine guns to defend against attacks from behind. they added a ball turret beneath the fuselage, a cramped spherical position where a gunner could rotate 360 degrees to engage fighters attacking from below. They installed a dorsal turret behind the cockpit with two more 50 caliber guns. The B-17E carried 950 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. Each gun could fire 750 rounds per minute out to an effective range of 3,500 feet. When multiple guns fired together, they created a cone of fire that no pilot wanted to fly through. The upgrade transformed the flying fortress from a vulnerable bomber into a defensive weapons platform that could, theoretically, protect itself. The B-17F, which began arriving in England in mid-1942, carried 11 guns. Additional positions in the nose allowed the bombardier and navigator to defend against head-on attacks. The waist positions on either side of the fuselage were strengthened. More ammunition was carried. The aircraft that the 8th Air Force would fly over Germany in 1943 was bristling with defensive firepower. By early 1943, American planners believed they had created a bomber that could survive deep penetration raids into Germany without fighter escort. The concept was simple. Fly the bombers in tight formations called combat boxes, position the aircraft so their defensive guns covered each other, create overlapping fields of fire that would destroy any fighter attempting to press home an attack. The self-defending bomber fleet would simply shoot its way through enemy defenses, drop its bombs, and return home. The theory was elegant. The mathematics seemed sound. A single combat box of 18 B-17s carried nearly 200 machine guns. A wing formation of 54 bombers fielded over 600 guns. German fighters attempting to attack such formations would face a wall of 50 caliber fire from dozens of guns simultaneously. The Americans calculated that no fighter pilot, no matter how skilled or brave, could survive pressing an attack through such defensive fire. German pilots had a different perspective. They had been fighting the RAF's night bombers for 2 years. They had developed tactics for attacking four-engine heavy bombers. They understood the vulnerabilities of large, slow aircraft that had to fly straight and level during their bombing runs. German fighter pilots were confident they could defeat the American bombers just as they had defeated earlier RAF daylight raids. The first major test came on January 27, 1943. When 58 American heavy bombers attacked the port of Wilhelmshaven on Germany's North Sea coast. This was the first American bombing raid against a target inside Germany itself. German fighters rose to meet them. The bombers flew in their combat box formations. Their gunners opened fire at extreme range, filling the sky with tracer fire. German pilots watched the tracers arcing toward them and adjusted their tactics accordingly. They attacked from angles the bombers could not effectively defend. They used diving attacks from above where the dorsal turret had limited traverse. They attacked from the sides, presenting difficult deflection shots for the American gunners. German pilots were surprised by the volume of defensive fire. The Americans were putting more rounds into the air than expected, but the fire was often inaccurate. American gunners were firing at extreme ranges where hits were unlikely. They were burning through ammunition without scoring kills. German pilots learned to accept some defensive fire as the price of pressing home their attacks. More importantly, German pilots noticed something crucial about the B-17's defensive layout. The nose was weak. Early B-17F models had only two hand-operated 50 caliber guns in the nose, manned by the bombardier and navigator, who were primarily focused on their bombing duties, not air combat. The bombardier had to abandon his bomb sight to man the nose gun. The navigator had to leave his maps and calculations. Neither man was a dedicated gunner. A head-on attack offered German pilots several advantages. The B-17's engines and cockpit were concentrated in the front of the aircraft. A few well-placed cannon shells into the nose could kill the pilot and co-pilot, rendering the entire aircraft uncontrollable. The nose guns had limited traverse and could only fire directly forward. A German fighter attacking from directly ahead presented the smallest possible target, while the massive B-17 presented a large target that was difficult to miss. German ace Egon Meyer is credited with developing the head-on attack technique to its fullest potential. Meyer commanded the first group of Fighter Squadron 2, flying Focke-Wulf FW-190s from bases in northern France. He studied the combat box formations carefully, analyzing their strengths and weaknesses like an engineer examining a mechanical system. Mayer realized that German fighters attacking from behind had to overcome the B-17's heaviest defensive firepower. The tail turret had excellent fields of fire. The ball turret could rotate to engage threats from below and behind. The waist gunners could bring their guns to bear. Any fighter attempting a stern attack faced perhaps 6 or 7 guns firing at once, but a head-on attack was different. Only the nose guns could engage. The combined closing speed of a fighter and bomber approaching head-on was over 600 miles per hour. German pilots would have perhaps 2 seconds to aim and fire before breaking away to avoid collision. It required extraordinary skill and nerves of steel. But for those pilots who mastered the technique, it was devastating. On November 23, 1942, Mayer recorded his first victories using head-on attacks. He shot down 2 B-17s and 1 B-24 Liberator in a single mission. The technique worked. Within weeks, other German fighter units were adopting similar tactics. By December 1942, head-on attacks had become the preferred method for engaging American heavy bombers. American bomber crews began reporting increasingly aggressive frontal attacks. German fighters were approaching in formations, sometimes 3 or 4 abreast, firing their 20mm cannons and machine guns before breaking away in steep dives. The attacks were terrifying. German fighters appeared as small dots ahead of the formation, growing larger with impossible speed until their cannon fire was hammering into the lead bombers. Pilots and co-pilots were being killed in their seats. Bombardiers were torn apart by exploding cannon shells. Entire crews died in the first seconds of combat. American casualties mounted through the autumn of 1942. Bomber groups reported mission losses of 10 to 15%, rates that were mathematically unsustainable. At such attrition rates, bomber crews would not survive their required 25 mission tours. The 8th Air Force needed better intelligence on German fighter tactics. They needed to understand how German pilots were defeating the combat box formation. They needed examples of what German fighters could and could not do. Then, on December 12, 1942, Lieutenant Paul Flickinger and his crew, flying B-17F Wolfhound from the 303rd Bomb Group, provided the Luftwaffe with exactly the intelligence they needed, though not intentionally. Flickinger's bomber had been damaged during a raid on the Luftwaffe servicing base at Romilly-sur-Seine, east of Paris. German fighters hammered the formation throughout the mission. Wolfhound took hits from multiple attackers. One engine was damaged. The hydraulic system failed. Control surfaces were shot up. Flickinger tried to keep up with his formation, but the damaged bomber was losing altitude and falling behind. A straggler, the worst fate a bomber crew could face. Inside the protection of the combat box, a damaged B-17 had the defensive fire of dozens of other bombers to help ward off attacks. Outside the formation, alone and vulnerable, a crippled bomber became easy prey. German fighters could attack at leisure, making pass after pass until the bomber went down. Flickinger made the decision to head for neutral territory. If he could reach the Netherlands or Switzerland, his crew might survive as internees rather than prisoners of war, or worse. But the bomber was losing altitude steadily. The remaining engines were overheating. Flickinger spotted the Luftwaffe airfield at Leeuwarden in the Netherlands. Below him, he had no choice. He put the bomber down on the German-occupied field. The crew destroyed sensitive equipment as best they could before German soldiers surrounded the aircraft. The Norden bomb site was smashed. Codebooks were burned, but the aircraft itself was largely intact. Within hours, German engineers were examining it with intense interest. This was the first American heavy bomber captured in flyable condition on the Western Front. The bomber was too valuable to leave at a forward airfield where it might be damaged or destroyed by Allied air raids. 2 days after the capture, on December 14th, a German crew climbed into the cockpit. they started the remaining operational engines. With an escort of two Bf-110 night fighters, they flew Wolfhound to Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's primary test and evaluation center. German fighter bases and flak units along the flight route were notified of the flight plan. Even with these precautions, German anti-aircraft gunners opened fire on the captured bomber. The sight of an enemy aircraft flying deep inside German airspace was simply too tempting. Wolfhound took minor damage from friendly fire before reaching Rechlin safely. It was an inauspicious beginning to what would become one of the most important intelligence coups of the European Air War. At Rechlin, German engineers began the painstaking work of understanding American bomber design. The facility was the Luftwaffe's primary testing center for all aircraft, both domestic and captured, located in a remote forested region of Mecklenburg. Rechlin housed workshops, laboratories, firing ranges, and airfields where German engineers evaluated everything from engine performance to defensive armament effectiveness. The team assigned to examine Wolfhound included aeronautical engineers, weapons specialists, and experienced Luftwaffe pilots. They had clear instructions from high command: determine the B-17's strengths, identify its weaknesses, develop tactics to exploit those vulnerabilities, find ways to defeat the American bomber offensive before it gathered unstoppable momentum. The engineers began with basic measurements. They weighed the aircraft, they measured dimensions, they examined construction techniques, they tested materials. They were methodical, thorough, professional. This was not propaganda work. This was technical intelligence, gathering at the highest level. What they found impressed them. The B-17F weighed approximately 32,000 pounds empty. Fully loaded with fuel, bombs, and ammunition, gross weight exceeded 55,000 pounds. 4 Wright Cyclone R-1820 radial engines, each producing 1,000 horsepower, drove the massive aircraft through the air at speeds up to 300 miles per hour at altitude. The structure was robust. Heavy-gauge aluminum alloys formed the fuselage and wing spars. Self-sealing fuel tanks filled the wings. Armor plate protected the pilots and critical flight systems. The aircraft was designed to absorb battle damage and continue flying. German engineers testing the airframe found it could withstand stresses that would tear apart lighter bomber designs. But what truly captured German attention was the defensive armament system. The engineers counted the guns, 11 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns positioned throughout the aircraft. They examined each position carefully, measured firing arcs, calculated fields of fire, determined dead zones where a fighter could attack with minimal exposure to defensive fire. The tail turret mounted 2 guns with excellent fields of fire covering the entire rear hemisphere. A fighter attacking from directly behind would face both guns firing simultaneously. The ball turret beneath the fuselage also mounted twin guns that could rotate 360 degrees and elevate from horizontal to near vertical. A third twin gun position sat in the dorsal turret just behind the cockpit. The waist positions on either side of the fuselage each held a single 50-caliber gun on a flexible mount. 2 more single guns defended the nose, operated by the bombardier and navigator. The radio operator had access to another gun that could fire through an opening above his station. The engineers did the mathematics. Each 50-caliber gun could fire 750 rounds per minute. The B-17F carried approximately 7,500 rounds of 50-caliber ammunition distributed among the gun positions. In theory, if all 11 guns fired simultaneously, the bomber could put over 8,000 rounds per minute into the air around it. In practice, no fighter attack would be exposed to all guns at once, but the numbers were still impressive. More importantly, the engineers examined the gun positions to understand where the defensive fire was concentrated and where it was weak. They mounted cameras at various points around the aircraft and photographed the firing arcs from each gun position. They created diagrams showing zones of coverage. They identified the approach angles where German fighters would face the heaviest fire and the angles where defensive fire was lightest. The results were enlightening. Attacks from behind and below faced the most defensive guns, potentially 5 or 6 weapons firing at once. Attacks from directly above or directly below also encountered multiple gun positions, but attacks from the front, from dead ahead along the bomber's flight path, faced only 2 guns in the nose, operated by crew members who were not dedicated gunners. This confirmed what German pilots had already discovered through combat experience. The frontal attack was the most vulnerable approach, at least on early B-17F models. But the engineers also noted that the Americans would not remain blind to this weakness. They would add more nose armament. They would improve the defensive coverage. Any tactical advantage the Luftwaffe gained from exploiting the weak nose would be temporary. 3 months of ground testing followed. German engineers ran the engines through performance tests. They examined the turbo supercharger system that allowed the bomber to operate effectively above 25,000 feet. They studied the oxygen system, the hydraulic systems, the electrical systems. They test-fired the guns on ground ranges, measuring muzzle velocities and ammunition feed reliability. Then came flight testing. On March 17, 1943, Flugzeugführer Böttcher made the first German flight in Wolfhound. The test mission lasted 90 minutes. Böttcher flew the bomber through basic maneuvers, checking handling characteristics, stall speeds, and control response. He climbed to altitude and ran the engines at combat power settings. He simulated bombing runs, holding the aircraft straight and level, while German engineers, in the gun positions, practiced tracking imaginary fighters. The flight revealed things that ground testing could not. The B-17 was stable, easy to fly, and remarkably forgiving of pilot errors. The controls were heavier than German bomber controls, but well harmonized. Visibility from the cockpit was excellent. The aircraft felt solid, substantial, like it could absorb punishment and keep flying. But the most important discovery came when German engineers manned the gun positions during simulated attack runs. Luftwaffe fighters from nearby bases were ordered to make mock attacks on Wolfhound, while the captured bomber flew defensive patterns over Rechlin. German fighter pilots flew their Bf-109s and FW-190s exactly as they would in combat, diving, climbing, and maneuvering around the American bomber, while German engineers in the B-17 tried to track them with the defensive guns. The results were sobering for the test engineers. Tracking a fighter in 3-dimensional aerial combat was extraordinarily difficult. The fighter pilots were experts at exploiting blind spots, timing their attacks to minimize exposure to defensive fire. They would appear suddenly, fire a burst, and disappear before the gunners could bring their weapons to bear effectively. The nose guns were particularly difficult to aim. The bombardier and navigator had to leave their primary duties to man the guns. The flexible mounts were awkward to operate. While wearing bulky flight suits and oxygen masks, the plexiglass nose offered excellent visibility, but also created disorientation as fighters approached at high closing speeds. The ball turret gunner, cramped into his spherical position, found tracking targets difficult when the bomber was maneuvering. The waist gunners faced fierce slipstream when they opened the windows to fire. At altitude, the temperature was 40 degrees below zero. Ice formed on guns and ammunition belts. Oxygen masks restricted peripheral vision. German engineers documented all these findings in detailed reports. They photographed the gun positions from various angles. They created training materials showing Luftwaffe fighter pilots exactly where the defensive blind spots were located. They calculated the optimal attack angles that minimized exposure to defensive fire while maximizing the chance of critical hits. But they also documented something else, something that would prove far more significant in the long run. The sheer volume of defensive firepower available to the B-17 was unlike anything German pilots had previously encountered. Even with all the blind spots and aiming difficulties, 11 50 caliber machine guns created a defensive envelope that was genuinely dangerous. A fighter pilot caught in the combined fire of multiple guns would be torn apart in seconds. The reports went up the chain of command to senior Luftwaffe leadership. Colonel Adolf Galland, who would later become General of Fighter Aircraft, examined the captured B-17 personally at Rechlin. His assessment was blunt and troubling. The B-17 united every possible advantage in one bomber: heavy armor, enormous altitude capability, colossal defensive armament, great speed for a heavy bomber. Galland understood immediately that the Luftwaffe faced a serious challenge. Individual German fighters might exploit the B-17's weaknesses to score kills. Skilled pilots might master the head-on attack. But the Americans were not sending individual bombers. They were sending formations of dozens, then hundreds of aircraft. Each formation represented thousands of defensive machine guns, creating overlapping fields of fire. The mathematics were brutal. A German fighter attacking a combat box formation of 18 B-17s faced nearly 200 machine guns. If the pilot pressed his attack to killing range, multiple guns from multiple bombers would be firing at him simultaneously. The defensive fire might be inaccurate, but volume compensated for accuracy. A pilot only needed to be unlucky once, and the Americans were still learning. The B-17F model at Rechlin was already being superseded by improved variants. The Americans were adding more guns, improving fire control systems, training gunners more effectively. The defensive capabilities would only increase as the war continued. Galland's reports circulated among senior Luftwaffe staff. They generated intense discussion and some controversy. Some officers argued that German fighters, properly employed with correct tactics, could still defeat American bomber formations. Others suggested focusing anti-aircraft artillery on the bombers and letting fighters concentrate on Allied escort fighters. Still others proposed developing specialized anti-bomber weapons, heavy cannons and rockets that could destroy B-17s from beyond defensive gun range. All these approaches would be attempted. None would prove decisively effective. The fundamental problem was not tactics or weapons. The fundamental problem was industrial capacity, though few German officers fully grasped this reality in early 1943. After completing its test program at Rechlin, Wolfhound began a tour of Luftwaffe fighter bases throughout Germany and occupied France. This was psychological operations as much as training. German fighter pilots needed to see the American bomber up close, needed to walk around it, needed to understand its size and construction. Many pilots had never been near a B-17 except during combat, when the bombers were distant shapes silhouetted against the sky. Standing next to Wolfhound on the tarmac, German fighter pilots gained new respect for American engineering. The bomber was massive, dwarfing even twin-engine German fighters. The four engines were powerful, clearly visible through their cowlings. The defensive gun positions were everywhere, protruding from the fuselage, rotating in their turrets, creating fields of fire that seemed to cover every approach angle. Experienced fighter pilots climbed into the gun positions and looked out through the gun sights. They tried to imagine what it felt like to be a B-17 gunner, surrounded by plexiglass and aluminum, watching German fighters diving toward you with cannons blazing. They tried to imagine working these guns while wearing oxygen masks in sub-zero temperatures, with anti-aircraft shells exploding around the formation. The demonstrations served their purpose. German fighter pilots who had toured Wolfhound understood the B-17's capabilities better. They developed more realistic expectations about what was required to shoot one down. They learned to respect the defensive armament while also learning to exploit its weaknesses. The intelligence gathered from examining the captured bomber would influence Luftwaffe tactics for the next 2 years. In June 1943, Wolfhound was displayed at an exhibition of captured Allied aircraft at Leertz Airfield. Alongside the B-17 sat examples of nearly every Allied combat aircraft operating over Europe: a B-24 Liberator, a P-47 Thunderbolt, a P-51 Mustang, a P-38 Lightning, British aircraft including an Avro Lancaster, de Havilland Mosquito, Hawker Typhoon, and Supermarine Spitfire. Senior Luftwaffe officers, technical experts, and industrial representatives attended the exhibition. This was Germany's opportunity to study Allied aviation technology in detail. The aircraft were examined, photographed, and documented. Technical intelligence officers compiled reports on every aspect of Allied aircraft design, from engines and propellers to armament and avionics. The exhibition revealed something that should have been deeply concerning to any observer with eyes to see it. The Americans and British were producing aircraft at scales Germany could not match. These were not experimental prototypes or limited production runs. These were standard production aircraft, representative of thousands being manufactured monthly in Allied factories. The P-47 Thunderbolt at the exhibition was one of thousands already delivered to combat units. American factories were producing hundreds of these fighters every month. The B-17 represented a production line that would eventually deliver over 12,000 bombers before the end of the war. The British Lancaster was being built at multiple factories across England at rates that exceeded all German heavy bomber production combined. But in June 1943, with German forces still controlling vast territories and the final outcome of the war still uncertain, these industrial realities were not yet fully apparent. German technical officers examined the captured aircraft and focused on tactical advantages and disadvantages. They calculated that German fighters, properly equipped and skillfully employed, could defeat Allied bomber formations. They believed Germany's technological sophistication would compensate for any Allied numerical advantages. They were studying individual trees without seeing the forest. The real significance of Wolfhound and the other captured aircraft was not what they revealed about Allied aircraft design. The real significance was what they represented about Allied industrial capacity, Allied pilot training programs, Allied logistics networks, and Allied determination to build whatever was necessary to win the war. After the exhibition, Wolfhound returned to Rechlin for additional trials. German engineers used the bomber to test tactics for DFS-230 glider operations, evaluating whether captured B-17s could be used to tow German assault gliders in special operations. The tests were inconclusive, but revealed the bomber's surprising versatility. In September 1943, Wolfhound was transferred to Kampfgeschwader 200, the Luftwaffe's Special Operations Unit. KG-200 operated captured Allied aircraft for clandestine missions, long-range reconnaissance, and specialized transport operations. The unit marked the B-17 with German identification code A3+AE and used it for various classified missions through 1944. By this time, the air war over Europe had evolved dramatically. The Americans had continued upgrading the B-17. The B-17G model, entering service in late 1943, finally addressed the weak-nosed defensive armament that German fighters had been exploiting. Boeing engineers added a chin turret beneath the nose with twin 50-caliber guns operated remotely by the bombardier. They added cheek guns, single 50-caliber weapons mounted on either side of the nose. The total armament increased to 13 guns. The B-17G represented the ultimate expression of the flying fortress concept. 13 defensive machine guns, nearly 7,500 rounds of ammunition, power-operated turrets that could track targets faster than manual mounts, improved gun sights, better heating systems for the guns to prevent freezing at altitude, staggered waist gun positions that gave gunners more room to operate. When German fighter pilots attacked B-17G formations in late 1943 and early 1944, they discovered the Americans had closed the defensive gaps. Head-on attacks now faced 4 to 6 guns, firing from the nose and dorsal turret positions. The volume of fire was intense, intimidating, genuinely dangerous. Luftwaffe fighter pilots adapted again. They began using heavier weapons, fitting 30mm cannons to their fighters that could destroy bombers from beyond 50-caliber machine gun range. They experimented with air-to-air rockets that could be fired from outside defensive gun range. They tried coordinated mass attacks where entire fighter groups would assault a single bomber formation simultaneously, overwhelming the defensive fire through sheer numbers. Some of these tactics achieved limited success, but all of them came with costs. The 30mm cannons were heavy, slow-firing, and difficult to aim effectively. The air-to-air rockets were inaccurate and unreliable. Mass, coordinated attacks required extensive training and perfect timing that became increasingly difficult as experienced German pilots were killed and replaced with hastily trained novices. And throughout this evolution, the fundamental problem remained unchanged. The Americans were producing B-17s faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. Every B-17 shot down was replaced by 2 more rolling off American production lines. every American aircrew killed was replaced by 3 more graduating from training schools in the United States. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The strategic situation was deteriorating for Germany on every front by mid-1944. Allied forces had landed in Normandy on June 6th. The Eastern Front was collapsing as Soviet forces pushed westward. German cities were being systematically destroyed by round-the-clock bombing. American heavy bombers attacked by day, British bombers attacked by night. There was no respite, no recovery time, no opportunity to rebuild damaged factories. The Luftwaffe fighter force was being bled white defending German airspace. Pilot training programs could not replace losses quickly enough. Fuel shortages, limited training flight hours, resulting in inexperienced pilots being thrown into combat with inadequate preparation. Aircraft production was hobbled by Allied bombing of key factories and by shortages of critical materials. By autumn 1944, the 8th Air Force was routinely dispatching bomber formations of 1,000 aircraft or more to targets across Germany. These massive raids represented over 13,000 defensive machine guns flying in tight formations. German fighters attacking such formations faced annihilation. The few experienced pilots who survived learned to attack stragglers and damaged bombers that had fallen out of formation. Attacking the intact combat boxes was increasingly suicidal. Wolfhound, the B-17 that had provided German engineers with their first detailed intelligence on American bomber capabilities, was destroyed in an American air raid on Oranienburg airfield on April 10, 1945. The bomber that had survived capture, 3 months of ground testing, numerous test flights, a touring exhibition, and transfer to a special operations unit was finally destroyed by bombs dropped from its American siblings. By then, the intelligence Wolfhound had provided was obsolete. The B-17G models dominating German skies in 1945 were substantially different from the B-17F, captured in December 1942. The American bomber offensive had evolved beyond anything German planners had anticipated when they first examined the captured aircraft at Rechlin. The real lesson of Wolfhound. The lesson that German intelligence officers struggled to articulate in their reports was not about gun positions or firing arcs or tactical vulnerabilities. The real lesson was about industrial war. The Americans had created a strategic bombing force that German defenses could not defeat because the force was backed by industrial capacity that Germany could not match. Between December 1942 and May 1945, American factories produced over 12,000 B-17 flying fortresses. Production peaked at over 300 bombers per month in 1944. Each aircraft represented approximately 150,000 pounds of aluminum, steel, and strategic materials. Each aircraft required 4 massive radial engines, each engine itself a marvel of precision engineering, requiring thousands of machined parts. The guns alone told the story. 1350 caliber Browning M2 machine guns per B-17G, 12,700 B-17s produced, over 160,000 machine guns. Built specifically for B-17 defensive armament, not counting the identical guns used in American fighters and ground vehicles. The Browning M2 was itself a masterpiece of reliable engineering, capable of firing tens of thousands of rounds with minimal maintenance. American factories were producing these weapons at rates that seemed impossible to German observers. The United States was also producing fighters, transport aircraft, training aircraft, engines, propellers, ammunition, bombs, vehicles, ships, electronics, and every other material of war at scales that dwarfed German production. The mathematics were inexorable. Even if German fighters achieved favorable kill ratios, even if every Luftwaffe pilot became an ace, even if every defensive system functioned perfectly, Germany could not win a war of attrition against American industrial production. The numbers simply did not allow for German victory once American manufacturing capacity was fully committed to the war effort. German technical intelligence officers examining Wolfhound at Rechlin in early 1943 had focused on tactical details. gun positions, firing arcs, armor thickness, engine performance, all important information for fighter pilots attempting to shoot down individual bombers. But they had missed, or perhaps could not bring themselves to fully acknowledge the strategic reality those details represented. Each captured Allied aircraft was not an intelligence prize. Each captured aircraft was a warning. The Americans and British were producing weapons in quantities that Germany could not match. They were training crews faster than Germany could train replacements. They were developing tactics and technologies faster than Germany could counter them. They had resources, factories, materials, and manpower on scales that made German efforts look primitive by comparison. Colonel Gallen's assessment, after examining Wolfhound, had been correct, though perhaps more correct than he realized. The B-17 did unite every possible advantage in one bomber. But the real advantage was not the guns or the armor or the altitude capability. The real advantage was the industrial system that could produce such aircraft by the thousands, while also producing everything else needed to fight a global war. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the American 8th Air Force alone had flown over 300,000 bomber sorties over Europe. The B-17 Flying Fortress had dropped approximately 640,000 tons of bombs on German targets. More than 4,700 B-17s were lost to all causes during the war. Yet, production so exceeded losses that thousands of surplus bombers sat in storage when the war ended. The defensive armament system that German engineers had studied so carefully at Rechlin had fulfilled its purpose. It had not made the B-17 invulnerable. German fighters shot down thousands of flying fortresses throughout the war. But the defensive guns had made attacking bomber formations costly enough that the Luftwaffe could not sustain the effort. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that could replace losses faster, and America replaced losses far faster than Germany could inflict them. German test pilot Böttcher, who had flown Wolfhound on that March morning in 1943, survived the war. So did many of the German engineers who had examined the captured bomber at Rechlin. After the war, some of them worked on American and Soviet aviation projects, applying lessons learned from both sides of the conflict. The technical knowledge gained from studying captured aircraft flowed in both directions, though the strategic lessons remained unlearned until it was too late. The B-17's 1350 caliber machine guns had indeed created a 360-degree death zone around American bomber formations. German fighter pilots who survived the war spoke with respect, sometimes grudging, about the defensive firepower they had faced. They had learned through bitter experience that pressing an attack through massed 50 caliber fire required courage that bordered on fatalism. Many of their comrades had died in those attacks, torn apart by defensive fire before they could deliver killing blows to the bombers. But the guns were only part of the story. The real story was about nations and industries, about factories and workers, about logistics and training systems. The real story was that America built 12,700 B-17s while also building 18,000 B-24 Liberators, 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts, 15,000 P-51 Mustangs, and hundreds of thousands of other aircraft. Germany could not match that production while simultaneously fighting on multiple fronts against enemies who also possessed vast industrial resources. The captured B-17 at Rechlin had provided valuable tactical intelligence. German fighter pilots used that intelligence effectively, shooting down thousands of American bombers. But tactical success could not overcome strategic failure. No amount of tactical brilliance, no number of individual victories could change the fundamental arithmetic of industrial war. Germany was fighting enemies who could produce weapons faster than Germany could destroy them. That reality, more than any tactical consideration, determined the outcome of the air war over Europe. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.